Welcome to Princess Manor. Baldy thrust open the squeaky, ragged door of the last rundown moving truck, peering into the familiar chaos that mirrored his disordered life. The weather-beaten truck, with its chipped paint and peeling emblem, had been filled to the brim with remnants of his past, dilapidated furniture, scattered magazines, and an old guitar that had seen better days. He climbed out, the heat of the late afternoon sun wrapping around him like an unwanted blanket, reminding him that something had to change. The name Hollow Pines loomed above him, painted in worn-out cursive on a wooden sign, each letter almost pleading with him to take a chance. Hollow Pines was not what he had imagined. The neighborhood was quaint, with old trees that lined the quiet streets, their leafy arms stretched out like welcoming hands. Yet beneath the surface lay an unsettling stillness, amplified by the whispers that drifted among the houses. Baldy took a deep breath, his determination fueling him as he surveyed the aesthetics of his new home. This was a fresh start, a chance for him to evade the past that clung to him like a persistent shadow. His dreams of financial stability were a mere flicker, igniting his urgency to settle. He eyed a few cars rolling by, cautious, even suspicious, of the new resident in their midst. As he maneuvered the unpacked clutter of the truck, he felt their gazes fixated on him, as if assessing his worth. The doubt chimed in his mind, could he become one of them? Would they ever accept him? Time would tell. The reality of his financial situation pressed harder as he cursed his luck. A capable man, he once held a promising job in the city, but a series of unfortunate events swept him from his pedestal, a redirecting current toward Hollow Pines. He had a roof overhead, sure, but the money trickled down like sand through his fingers. This was supposed to be a new beginning, but it was hopelessly tethered to his failures. With a heavy sigh, Baldy made his way toward the local diner, a staple in any small town's heartbeat. It was a haven for weary travelers and comfort seekers. He briefly considered it his lifeline. Grabbing a part-time position there became a desperate choice. The bell above the door jangled merrily as he entered, its sound almost mocking in its cheer, contrasting starkly against his somber reality. The diner's faded checkered floors were still busy with morning patrons, careless chatter, and the aroma of overbrewed coffee mingling with freshly cooked eggs. Sitting at the counter were several odd characters, each with their quirks, perhaps as lost as he, solidifying that he wasn't alone in his bewilderment. In the corner booth sat a woman with thick glasses, scribbling notes furiously. Baldy overheard the locals referring to her as the Virgin, an aloof title, hinting at an innocence that evoked both sympathy and curiosity. Across from her was another figure, the report, who meticulously documented every event, every excuse to engage with gossip that caught his interest. There was also the impersonator, a man who miraculously transformed into anyone in his vicinity, weaving in and out of conversations with unmatched charisma. Lastly, there was the victim, a scarred soul whose silences and half-smiles spoke volumes about struggles far more significant than Baldy's own tragedy. As he served pancakes with an extra scoop of butter, Baldy became entranced by their melodrama, the way their lives intertwined in a fragile community tapestry. Then one day, a rumor floated through the air, unlike any he had encountered before. Whispers of unsettling experiments conducted at the town's edge crept into his ear, tickling his imagination. The thought tugged at him, igniting a flicker of mischief in his otherwise mundane existence. What if he acted upon this rumor? He could distract himself from his own financial decline, amplify the story swirling among the colorful characters he had come to know. With a tight grin, he mentally set forth on weaving a new thread into the fabric of Hollow Pines, unaware of what lay ahead. Baldy, sitting behind the counter, watched the crowd as he scribbled the rumor into his notepad, hungry for acceptance, yet unwilling to lose himself in the deceptive comfort of illusion. The air crackled with the tension of unspoken secrets, as if the trees themselves were whispering their hidden truths. A sense of foreboding settled in his gut, a reminder that even as he sought a new beginning, Hollow Pines had its own dark soul to reckon with. Web of whispers. Baldy gazed out from the diner's grimy window, the morning light pouring into the shabby establishment like a reluctant visitor. After a week in Hollow Pines, the novelty of the quaint surroundings had faded, revealing an unsettling undercurrent among the residents. He noticed the way people exchanged glances, whispering behind their hands, their eyes darting toward the dense woods that bordered the town like a dark secret waiting to be unveiled. At the diner, Baldy had found an unlikely camaraderie with the eccentric crowd. The Virgin, a timid woman in her late 20s, spent her breaks clinging to the worn counter as if it were her life raft, her pallor suggesting a life lived in the shadows of paranoia. The Report, an elderly gentleman with wild gray hair and a penchant for gossip, sat in a booth, scribbling notes that he claimed were vital to unraveling the mystery of Hollow Pines. Then there was the impersonator, a hyperactive young man who couldn't stop pretending to be characters from movies, his antics providing levity even as they raised eyebrows. And finally, the victim, a quiet man with a haunted look in his eyes, often speaking of oppression in a town that seemed to feast on fear. As they gathered, Baldy noticed their conversations veering toward the same foreboding topic, a rumor he had unnervingly ignited during an idle conversation. Someone had mentioned the scientists at the edge of town, those who conducted bizarre experiments that the local children dared not speak of. At first, it was mere speculation, whispered after taking a sip of coffee or in hushed tones during shifts, but it quickly morphed into an unholy communion of dread. Today, as Baldy hustled between patrons, the rumor took on a life of its own. "They say they're turning animals into something unnatural," the Virgin whispered, her voice feather-light as she leaned closer, eyes wide with fear. "Someone told me they saw a cat with 3 eyes. You don't think?" Her sentence trailed off, horrified by the implication. "They're messing with our water supply," the Report chimed in, eyes flickering with titillation. "That's why their experiments are so secretive. They don't want the world to find out what's brewing here in Hollow Pines." Baldy felt a chill race down his spine. The adrenaline he usually sought in the chase of fortune transformed into the creeping terror that his own creation would threaten the very fabric of the community. But amid his anxiety, he felt a pulse of desperation. Could this tale distract the townsfolk from his financial troubles? His predicament felt lighter the more he swirled the rumor in their minds, channeling their terror toward something other than his failing finances. The air thickened with tension, a palpable fear that curled around the diner like fog. As the day wore on, conversations became frantic, and the load of Baldy's conscience weighed heavier. The line between truth and fiction blurred with every terrified glance exchanged. He watched as the Virgin nervously picked at her food, her resolve visibly crumbling, and a wave of guilt crashed over Baldy. That night, as he lay in the dim attic of the apartment he rented, shadows slithered along the walls. The stillness was interrupted only by the sound of scraping branches against the window. He couldn't sleep, haunted by the uncertainty of what he had unleashed. The surrounding trees seemed to whisper his name, calling him out to expose the truth or defend the lie he had woven. Tomorrow, he would return to the diner for another shift, facing those who gripped at hope with trembling hands, illusions contrasting cruelly with the stark realities of life in Hollow Pines. Would he confess? Or would he watch as their fear blossomed, gratifying his own interests, even if it meant risking their safety? The conflict between compassion and ambition loomed like a dark cloud, ready to burst. Hollow Pines had changed him, challenging his instincts and complicating his desire for a fresh start. And as the whispers crept into his mind, he was left to wonder if maybe the true terror was not in the darkness outside but the shadows lurking within himself. Echoes of fear. The early morning light slipped through the rickety blinds of Baldy's small apartment, casting jagged shadows on the walls that felt more suffocating than welcoming. He sat on the edge of his worn-out mattress, his head heavy with the weight of what he had unknowingly unleashed upon Hollow Pines. The rumblings he'd initiated were now echoing in every nook and corner of the neighborhood, twisting lives and perceptions like so many tattered pages from a book he could no longer control. As he dressed, he could hear muffled voices mingling with the chatter of pots and pans from the diner below. The truth of the rumors loomed heavier now, and the residents' conversations only served as a reminder of his plummeting morality. Deep down, he questioned whether his decision to amplify the vague rumors had been driven by desperation or the darker, more seductive lure of notoriety. He would soon discover how quickly speculation could morph into panic. The diner was his refuge, albeit a crumbling one. As he walked in, he was met with nervous glances that flickered away from his presence, like moths dodging the flame. Baldy greeted the usuals hesitantly, the Virgin, the Report, the impersonator, and the victim, each now seemingly shackled by the weight of the malign gossip that flowed like a virus. "Did you hear about the lights in the woods last night? People say it's them, those scientists." The Virgin, usually the timid seeker of validation, trembled as she spoke, her chair creaking under nervous shifts. "My neighbor swears he saw something moving outside his window." "What if "Everyone's just fed up and scared," scoffed the impersonator, swirling a spoon in his coffee like a magician hiding his tricks. "You're feeding the fear, Baldy. Who's to say it wasn't all a joke?" His gaze was piercing, demanding recognition of the harm that rumor was causing. Baldy felt the heat rise in his cheeks, guilt mingling with the panic he had sowed. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he stammered, searching for the right words to convey remorse amid his chaotic thoughts. Yet, the self-preservation instincts that had driven him for so long whispered sweeter lies, suggesting that maybe this chaos played in his favor. It was around lunchtime when the unexpected guests began to arrive, shadowy figures clad in lab coats, their demeanor stark against the cheerful checkered layout of the diner. With questions spilling into the air as they approached, Baldy felt the frail grip of his recent choices slipping. These were researchers, mystery mongers who had come to investigate what he had spread. A silence washed over the diner when they inquired about the rumors. Fear morphed into an electric charge, suspending everyone in a moment of disbelief. At that moment, the victim, usually meek and invisible, was no longer just a name in a hushed conversation. Her face paled, the concern in her eyes reflecting the depth of what the streets were buzzing about. "What if something happens?" she uttered, fixing her gaze on Baldy. "What if they find something dangerous?" At that moment, the reality of his actions crashed down atop him like a weight unshakable. The dismissal he'd hoped to escape had summoned a very real consequence, and panic coursed through Hollow Pines as if it were alive. Amidst the rising winds of fear and blame, Baldy felt an odd flicker of opportunity emerge. The professors, sensing a disturbance, turned toward him, their eyes narrowing. "We could use someone with local knowledge," one murmured, glancing over his clipboard. "Perhaps you would be interested in joining our research team." Baldy's heart raced, torn between the ethical decay he was wading through and the potential climb to security. Would he forsake the remainder of his integrity for an outstretched hand? The murmurs around him grew louder, shadows of ambiguity swirling in the very air he breathed. The panic he had ignited began to paint a new landscape: confusion, tragedy, and now, a chance for something greater. The crisis fueled a vicious cycle, binding each resident in its grip. What concealed hope did Baldy have as he faced the ever-growing riptide of consequences? Staring out the diner window toward the encroaching woods, he felt his heart beat faster, the whispers of regret tangled with ambition. How quickly his life could spiral, how easily reputations could be shredded. And yet, beneath it all, a singular question loomed in his mind: could he reclaim Hollow Pines from the grips of his whispered lies before it was too late? The rumor materializes. The chaos in Hollow Pines had reached an unsettling crescendo. With the quaint suburb now the epicenter of a fear-induced frenzy, curiosity intertwined with dread had drawn visitors from neighboring towns, investigative journalists, and a flurry of research groups all vying to uncover the mystery of the rumored experiments at the outskirts of town. Baldy, on the other hand, was left to wrestle with the consequences of his rapid ascent to infamy. As he stepped out of his small rented house that afternoon, the air was thick with unease. The fraying edges of the close-knit community were revealing themselves in stark ways. Reports had spread that several locals had been seen near the outskirts of town, seemingly having vanished into thin air. Such tales lent credence to the rumors Baldy had crafted in desperation, now twisting the narrative like vines creeping unrestrained. Baldy ambled towards the diner where he had to manage the awkward glances and hushed whispers directed at him from the regulars with whom he'd once shared brief moments of camaraderie. The door chimed hollowly as he pushed through, the familiar scent of fried food and cleaning solutions mingling with an anxious buzz. It was as if the heart of Hollow Pines had manifested in that small space, filled with dread and suspicion. That day could hardly be considered a normal shift as the restaurant was peppered with reporters and gawking townfolk eager to hear tales from anyone willing to share. It was hard to remain incognito. In the corner, the Virgin sat with an air of quiet resilience, her delicate hands wrapping around a steaming mug. Baldy noticed she was receiving cautious glances, but instead of succumbing to fear, she rallied a few locals, encouraging them to come together in light of the ongoing panic. "Don't let them scare you, we have to stand together," she boldly declared, earning murmurs of agreement from a few gathered neighbors. Baldy had a stark realization at that moment. There was in her a sense of strength that had eluded him, a judgment that transcended the societal whispers that had weighed heavily on his conscience. Meanwhile, he felt like a silhouette in the gloom, juxtaposed against her bright conviction. As patrons filled the diner, their conversations shifted from mundane events to the electrifying rumors surrounding them. Baldy's own name was mentioned more than once in jest, mockingly as a modern-day three-ring circus master, clinging desperately to a show spiraling in all directions. But he felt less like the ringleader and more like an unwilling participant tangled in the tent fabric. The situation took a harrowing turn when sirens blared in the distance, moving closer, fracturing the unease that permeated the diner. The cloud of uncertainty coalesced, and anxiety spilled over into the atmosphere as everyone rushed outside to witness the scene unfolding. An emergency vehicle had arrived at the outskirts of town, the one place rumored as the epicenter of the sinister experiments. His gut churned. Did this signify that something more menacing had manifested? It had been a year since he'd left his old life behind, and now, the stench of his prior desperation and lies clawed back at him. The reports swirling in the community were becoming real, a feeling of dread suffused the very air they breathed. Baldy's phone buzzed uneasily against his leg, breaking through the tidal wave of murmurings. It was a message from a mysterious number, the sender offering him a chance, an invitation to join the research team investigating the very rumors that he'd set into motion. It was an opportunity laced with shadows, elevating his ambition yet entangling him deeper in his own deception. Would he seize this chance? Or would he confess the truth behind the rumors, risking the little trust that remained? Baldy's heart raced, the flames of ambition flickering, burning brightly yet dangerously close to the conflagration of ruin. Real freedom, he pondered, lay entwined on the precipice of his next choice, to ascend to heights unknown or to tumble into the abyss he himself had wrought. The weight of Hollow Pines settled heavier on his shoulders, nothing could stay buried forever. As the din of chaos swelled outside, Baldy stood at the doorway of the diner. Hollow Pines had changed. It was no longer a refuge, but a web of lies clamoring to ensnare him. The next moment would define not just his fate but perhaps that of the entire neighborhood. The choice lay before him, sharp and ruthless like the chill in the autumn air, pulsating with tension. A fractured future. Baldy stood at the edge of the research facility's fenced boundary, overlooking the chaotic landscape that Hollow Pines had become. The community had started to fracture, a puzzle missing too many pieces, the rush of frantic conversations and fearful glances wrapping around him like the encroaching fog. He had sought a fresh start, but this was not what he had envisioned. The weight of the choices he had made pressed down on him, threatening to crush his resolve. As whispers continued to snake through the streets like the restless wind, Baldy felt the palpable change in the air. The once quiet neighborhood buzzed with paranoia, the laughter replaced by anxious chatter about shadowy figures supposedly seen lurking near the research center. Each rumor seemed to grow more outlandish than the last, yet they all contained a spark of truth that made them more intoxicating than bitter. Despite the chaos he'd ignited with his careless words, a flicker of ambition surged within him. The invitation from the research team hung in his mind like a delicious secret. Opportunity had knocked. A position that could pull him from financial ruin, yet at what cost? Would he stride confidently into that bright future while leaving behind the shambles of his past? Or could he finally confront the repercussions of his deception? At the diner, the Virgin, once terrified and anxious, now stood with her head held high amidst the din of terrified patrons. The thick fog of fear had brought her clarity, illuminating her purpose. With a resolute tone, she rallied the residents, insisting they organize, support each other, and learn the truth behind the terrifying experiments. Echoes of her conviction rippled through Baldy's mind, a challenge to the apathy and cowardice he had embraced. "Look at what you've done," a voice in his head whispered. "You've inspired a leader where there once was only fear. But at what price?" Gazing at the Virgin, her voice rising above the din, he envisioned a life where community flourished, a life free from the web of deception he had spun. In that moment, he felt the urge to confide, to lay bare the truth behind the rumors, to warn them that the hysteria could lead to real consequences. But the lure of personal ambition was strong. How could he betray the chance at redemption his past failures had denied him? He shifted uneasily, observing the report and the impersonator huddled together, whispering. They flicked nervous glances at the chaos around them, choosing self-preservation over the community welfare they purported to cherish. From that distance, he could feel their hesitation, to confront change, to grapple with this unavoidable transformation. Yet change was coming to Hollow Pines, that was certain. The mediating presence of the victim haunted Baldy's mind. He could almost see that longing gaze, a reminder of the price paid by those drawn into the fray. While the Virgin sought to uplift, the victim had paid the ultimate toll, caught in the riptide of turmoil that his words had created. Balancing between the values of truth and ambition, Baldy appraised the fractures around him. His choices had cleaved this community, and the shifting views between neighbor and neighbor provided a stark contrast to the life he once knew. Beneath a facade of suburban normalcy, the fibers of fear, ambition, and deception intertwined, forming a web that could ensnare or entrap. As Baldy turned away from the scene, the roar of emotions danced within him. What would it be? Redemption or ambition? Out of all the characters surrounding him, the Virgin, the report, the impersonator, only he seemed to lack clarity, yet he held the key to the very change they sought and feared in equal measure. The sun began to dip below the jagged horizon, the shadows lengthened, whispering the same haunting truth. The choices they faced could shape Hollow Pines for generations. Heaving a deep breath filled with uncertainty, Baldy stepped away from the precipice of his fractured future, knowing his next steps were anything but certain. If only he could redeem himself before the whispers led him into the heart of darkness once again. The whisper lives on. As the chilling twilight fell upon Hollow Pines, the unsettling whispers that had enveloped the quaint neighborhood intertwined with the evening mist. Confronted with a heart heavy with the burdens of guilt and ambition, Baldy found himself at the precipice of his life's choices. Around him, the once cozy houses loomed larger, casting long shadows over his thoughts. The chaos that unraveled over the past weeks had left the neighborhood fractured yet oddly changed. Petty arguments among residents mounted as the remnants of unfounded fears fluttered in the air, unresolved and enigmatic. Those who had once sat together at the diner and shared humble pleasantries were now mere specters of their former selves, torn between the gossamer threads of conversation that often led to bitter disputes. Baldy had been invited to the research team primarily due to the panic the rumors had instigated. Doctors now shuffled about the townsfolk, armed with clipboards and concern. But instead of feeling relief, he was suffocated by an overwhelming sense of dread, the notion that he had birthed this situation in his desperate attempt to sidestep his own financial despair. He slid into a booth at the diner, a husk of what was once a welcoming rendezvous for the neighborhood. The Virgin was clearing tables and seemed to ignore him whenever their eyes crossed. Baldy longed to speak to her, to apologize and extend his hand in understanding, but something kept him rooted in his seat, imprisoned by shame. The air was thick with tension, punctured only by the chime of the doorbell whenever another anxious soul entered seeking solace. Baldy was aware of the stirring rumors that bubbled in hushed voices. A neighborhood meeting had been called to address the fear that gripped Hollow Pines, and he questioned whether his absence would speak louder than his presence. "Baldy," a quivering voice called from behind him. It was the Virgin, her eyes wide with determination. The traces of fear still had a stranglehold on her, but the remnants of her quiet strength shone through. "We need to talk." He turned, slowly nodding as she slid into the seat across from him. "I heard about the invitation," she said cautiously, as though probing for a marker she could trust. "You're choosing to work with them, aren't you?" "I don't know what to do," he conceded, his voice a strained whisper. I need this opportunity, but, she probed, leaning forward. "It's my fault, all of this." He gestured vaguely at the diner, and the residents milling about. "The fear and the chaos, the only thing I wanted was a distraction from my own life." "You can still change things, you know," she said softly. "You could use your influence in a meaningful way, help these people heal. They need hope, Baldy, not another deception." A crowd had started to gather just outside the diner. Curious faces peered through the glass, voicing concerns and clutching onto pieces of support that had begun to fall apart. The conversations were a melange of speculation and fear, rumors morphing into accusations that rippled like a stone cast in still water. "Are we to continue living in shadows?" Another voice floated in from outside as the residents rallied. "Or can we confront the truth of our fears?" It dawned on Baldy that he was torn between two roads, the pursuit of ambition via the research opportunity or the path of redemption through honesty. Perhaps both could intertwine, he pondered, a murky confluence of truth and ambition. But with the collective stakes so high, could he really gamble on both? Determined, Baldy rose from his seat abruptly, fear and resolve coursing through him as he marched towards the door. The murmurs grew louder, Faced with the reality of their despair, he would speak. He would not hide from his choices anymore. Even at that moment, with the din of chaos mounting around him, Baldy felt an ethereal connection to Hollow Pine's whispering promises of both hope and consequence. The confrontation had begun, but the whisper of truth, would it remain cloaked in shadows, or would it forge a new path? Only time would tell, as the journey was only just beginning.
Take me away, because talking shit will waste your time. People wonder why people constantly die. Baby, play games that aren't intended to play. Yeah, you play these games with me, games with thee, everybody.
Welcome to the Bobby Sun News Channel. Like, comment, subscribe for more great content brought straight to you. Peace, baby!